resources. These considerations, directive power and financial support, don't apply with the work of the Council of Europe itself. But it is sometimes when it is taken up by, the ideas are taken up by other institutions, that trouble comes. You may remember that the British government subscribed quite happily to the Council of Europe Convention on social rights, and fought like anything against exactly the same things once they became part of the social chapter of the Treaty of Maastricht.
That particular document you refer to, the recommendation, which came after the Intergovernmental Forum, I think is a very interesting document because it's also supported by a set of explanatory notes written for users, and particularly with policymakers and decision makers in mind. How was that document set out then? I think it's not well known to many people. Perhaps it ought to be more widely referred to.
Yes. Well, the recommendation itself does not require, because it can't, but it does recommend governments to link the professional qualifications that they control to the levels of the European framework. But more important than that, it does strongly recommend to member governments that if they do so, then in the conduct of tests and examinations leading to those qualifications, they must meet the accepted requirements of good international practice. In particular, that the objectives, criteria, and examining practices, marking schemes, syllabuses, should be transparent.
Right.
They should be published and available to all the users, to candidates, to those who prepare them for examination, and those who use the results of the examination, and also open to inspection by experts in the field.
Of course, this is an immensely important point to make, because before any forms of alignment can be brought forward and justified, whether I suppose it's a course book or an exam, some professional practices have to be in place to ensure that what it is that's been produced meets the requirements in ways that are suitable to the profession in question, so for pedagogic or assessment purposes. And thereafter, there are ways in which the practice can continue. So it's not in the case of exams, for example, producing an exam once and then benchmark it in some way to a framework is not very helpful if you have to produce multiple versions of your examination every year and administer it in many, many different contexts. And I think, if I remember correctly, that document is very helpful, particularly in the explanatory notes, in pointing out the requirements for appropriate examination development and administration by directing readers towards the various codes of practice and standards documents which now exist to guide practitioners.
But rather to use the recommendation, which after all has been agreed to by all the member governments to whom it is addressed, and insist that the recommendations are carried out. That I would take to be a positive response rather than a purely negative and copying response. Because I don't think it is right to say, for example, I mean, some of the criticisms, extreme criticisms are laughable, really. I know in the early days there was the suggestion that if the framework was accepted, then all research in applied linguistics would cease. And recently there is the criticism that it is just a response to petty squabbles about local squabbles about qualifications, or that it is an attempt to force everybody into a narrow mould where their arms are pinioned to their sides and they have no freedom of action. This is simply not the case. I think if people look carefully at the framework itself, and particularly the first 2 chapters in which the whole approach and ideology is explained, and then look at the nature of the recommendation in 2008-7 and the explanatory notes, and then use those as a way of ensuring that the highest standards of integrity and professional competence are maintained by the bodies that claim to be adhering to the framework, then I think that would be a very much more positive way forward.
I totally agree, but I think we still end up with the danger that people are looking for answers that aren't there. Now, perhaps that's a danger we can't deal with. For example, you want to know how to do it in your own context. So you have the common framework, which gives you a framework of reference, and then you're still looking for the answer. Well, so what? What do we do? How do I know how to implement the level system for my policies related to immigration, or how do I do it in relation to my accepting people in my university, or what have you?
Well, then what we hope will happen is that people looking for local solutions to their own problems will work hard and honestly and transparently to solve those problems and to produce a solution, and to then inform other people about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and what their decisions are, which then other people can use or modify or adapt to their own conditions. In that way, where the implementation questions that you're speaking of have to be faced and solved by particular institutions, governments and non-governmental, then the exchange of information using the apparatus of the framework or any other means that they find suitable for communicating with other people about their problems and their solutions will lead to a raising of activity all told.
And that highlights one of the indeed noted advantages of the framework from the beginning, is that it should provide metaphorically a common language.
Yes.
For addressing similar problems,
yes,
but perhaps leading to different outcomes dependent on circumstances.
It must
and
lead to different outcomes because the outcomes depend upon the local circumstances, which are different in each case. In order to apply the principles to any particular language, and indeed to any particular group of learners of a language, at different stages and in different contexts. These, a general framework cannot provide the answers to those questions. They must be worked at
Sure.
by the people who are responsible in those contexts.
Well, this is definitely made clear in the documents you've referred to,
Yeah.
both in the framework and in the recommendations and notes that go with it. I think that the user, though, is left with these dilemmas. You've got the one we've already mentioned, which is the general or common compared with the specific and local. The other one, which I think we're also moving on to, is the framework is a document which exists in time, 2001, and we're now 10 years on. To what extent is there, do you feel, as a user perhaps, that you can modify the framework? And to what extent should it be an evolution into the future? Because if you take it too far, you move away from its commonality, and it no longer has its value as something which is general and everyone uses it. So these tensions which are there are raising questions, I think, which people are struggling with.